Siveza iqiniso sivuselela ukuthembeka.
We're now going to move on to the topic of artificial intelligence and the future of journalism education. Ms. Gwen Lister is going to be moderating the session for us. I think she's no stranger at all to Namibians and also those outside of Namibia. First female editor of the Namibian newspaper, former editor, and she was in that position for many, many years. She also just recently released a book titled Comrade Editor. So Gwen, it's over to you. Please to introduce your guests for the moderating session, and we'll chat later.
Thank you very much, Nina, and hi to Patrick in the corner over there. Thank you for the introduction. It's my pleasure to introduce to everybody our two panelists today, both of whom are very well acquainted with the topic of artificial intelligence in the newsroom as it pertains to journalism. And I know from prior interactions with both our guests, both see artificial intelligence as more of an opportunity than a threat. Without further ado, let me introduce Mattia Peretti. Mattia is the manager of journalism AI at Polis, which is the international journalism think tank of the London School of Economics. And this informs media organizations about the potential of AI-powered technologies. The project offers a lot more than that, but I'm going to hand over to Mattia to tell you a little bit more about that once I've introduced our second panelist. So very welcome. Thank you for joining us, Mattia.
Thank you, Gwen. Thank you, everybody.
Cool. Our next guest is Styli Charalambous, and Styli is CEO and co-founder of the South African-based Daily Maverick, which was founded in 2009. And if I'm putting it correctly, Styli is responsible for the non-journalism side of things at the Maverick. And he looks at different media models as well as innovation, media news, innovation efforts. And that most certainly includes the subject we are talking about today. So I'm hoping we're going to explore this topic of AI and journalism, also keeping in the back of our minds at all times, if possible, that the theme of this conference is telling the truth and engendering trust among our audience. So it'd be nice if we look at this subject in relation to that. Styli, welcome.
Good morning. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining. Maybe I can dive straight in with a question kind of for both of you. To many people, I'm thinking possibly not many of those who've joined us today, artificial intelligence can be a bit of a fuzzy concept. So I wonder if we could actually start out by the two of you perhaps giving us three concrete examples of where and how you think AI can make a difference in terms of good journalism and to help improve the work of journalists. Styli, maybe I can start off with you.
Yeah, Gwen, I think one of the most important places is just as we move into this world of data everywhere and big data, just grappling, handling data, making connections between relationships in documents or in source documents that investigative journalists obtain, for example, and being able to go through that much quicker, more efficiently, more accurately than they would in a traditional way of investigating a cache of documents. I think that's one of the first ways we've seen it work. We use some of that on the work that we did with the crypto leaks in being able to draw out these relationships between entities in documents that were scanned or OCR'd, and then being able to then see how they all mapped together and being able to literally connect the dots between some of these people, places, and things that were mentioned in these documents. And so AI and machine learning allows us to do that, the computing power, being able to pick up these data elements and data points from different documents and then piece it all together. So tools that we can use to speed up and to improve the efficiency and accuracy of our investigative work is certainly one area that I think is starting to be used more and more as the world starts to produce infinitely more amount of data than ever before.
Thank you for that, Styli. Mattia, you want to chip in on that and give some practical examples from your side of things?
So it's kind of perfect to follow up on what the perfect example that Styli mentioned. Normally, when we talk about AI and examples and use cases with our community, we normally categorize the various use cases in 3 areas. So the first one is exactly what Styli was referring to, the news gathering, the power for investigations. Then moving through the journalistic production of news, there is the part of news, of the production of news. That's the most common example, the one that, at least in our experience, people think of first when they're thinking about AI, which is the automatically writing articles starting from data. So churning out, for example, earning reports for financial news in an automated way. And that's a clear example that has made a difference for newsrooms efficiencies already. And then the third area moving along the process is the news distribution as well. So examples of using machine learning, for example, to use what we know about our audiences to cater to what they need and what they want in terms of context with smart recommendations, for example, but also from the business side in trying to monetize this process by, for example, building smart paywalls that, powered by machine learning, can try to optimize the revenue of the organization thanks to those data that we were referring to that we get from our audiences and their behavior in interacting with our content.
So what I'm hearing, especially from Styli, is as far as journalism is concerned, it seems that the main thrust of AI is in helping investigative journalists do their work, especially when they have to go through vast tranches of data. And Styli mentioned the Gupta leaks as an example, and of course there are other famous examples like the Panama Papers and things like that, really in helping journalists go through tons of data, which ordinarily would take an awful long time to do. But it still strikes me that there's a lot and many aspects of journalism where AI won't work, where the journalist simply has to be physically present, if you think about even court reporting or something like that. So just to narrow it down, are we then sort of looking at AI's use mainly in terms of investigative journalism? And yes, I hear what you're saying. There are a lot of other areas where it is very useful, and maybe Styli can speak to that in terms of testing your audience on their likes and dislikes and what they read and what they don't read. I'd like to hear a little bit more about that, because when it comes to engendering trust in our audience, it's very important to know what they want. Styli, maybe you want to jump in on that first.
Yeah, Gwen, I wouldn't say that the primary use case or the most important use case is that. I would say that as any media organization starts down this road, that we need an overall AI strategy, and each organization needs to figure out how is it that we want to engage with AI, which are the areas of the value chain we see benefits from AI, for example. And I actually think that we might even in court reporting be able to use AI. You know, what if we had, because there are more courts than there are reporters, and what if we could take a stream of a feed from each of those courts, which could then be ingested into a data warehouse. We convert that from language into structured text, which we can then categorize and segment and then use and summarize or pick out the important ones that we want to report on. So I think we're limited by not just our imagination, but the skills that we have access to and the financial resources we have to be able to invest in this. But I think if we look at every part of the value chain of a media organization, there are absolutely benefits in every case that we can have. And it's really just about for each organization to prioritize and say, well, this is where we can find the biggest benefit or the biggest impact for the investment that we're able to make. This is where we can start. This is who is going to be responsible for the AI policy and driving AI use in the organization. And these are the quick wins, and this is the roadmap that we're going to go down that road for. So it's going to be down to each organization, the leadership within an organization, to choose the AI champion, and then the strategy, and then the practical implementation of each of those.
Cool. Mattia, what do you think? I'm sure you have something to add to that in terms of, as I say, I must correct myself because I'm seeing what Styli says. Maybe there is certainly room for something like that. I think in our own example right now, we've got this ongoing fish rot corruption case in court. And when you see the stream, you see all these journalists sitting there for hours on end, and maybe their work could be streamlined and helped if there were feeds that they could access back at the office. Of course, that doesn't take away from the fact that, you know, journalists need to be looking at their subject and the body language and things like that. So, but any other examples that you can give us from your work, Mattia, which pertains to really helping the work of journalists with AI?
I was nodding vigorously as Styli was talking, because I completely agree with his point of view, especially what he was saying about the need for organizations to think strategically about AI. So it's not just about adopting all possible tools at the same time, also because there is a lack of skills and resources in most newsrooms, so that's just not gonna work. So the idea of prioritizing what are the needs of a newsroom, and then identifying what are the use cases that specific organization is readier to start with, depending on the resources available, the skills, and again, the priorities that are defined. I think that's key in terms of like the successful implementation. And that's what we're hearing from the experts in our network as well. Thinking about another example where I think we obviously don't want to give the idea to journalists that AI can do everything, because that's not true. The idea is to help journalists. And in that sense, with that framing, AI can do pretty much everything, because as Styli was saying, across the process, there are ways to use technology to make the work of the journalist more efficient, or to just scale the work of a newsroom to a point that just the number of people in the newsroom could not achieve by themselves. I think a perfect example of this framing is the idea of using machine learning, for example, for comment moderation. That doesn't usually mean, in that case, when it's applied by organizations like El País in Spain or New York Times and many others, that doesn't mean that there is an algorithm taking care of the entire comment moderation process. The idea is that via machine learning, those comments can be pre-moderated in a sense, so that the journalist, and probably you don't have in your staff 10 different journalists who can go through all the comments that you receive from your audiences, can only focus on the comments that the algorithms filters as risky, because there is potential of hate speech in there, or because they are completely irrelevant, maybe it's spam. So the idea of just, again, using the technology to simplify and make the work of the journalist more efficient, not to entirely replace them.
Exactly. Mattia, maybe a question, because you work in a more global context with newsrooms, possibly across the world and so on. What is your take, if you like, on the whole North-South divide in terms of the rollout of AI? And especially, you know, one gets the feeling that the bigger media companies, whether it's the New York Times or whatever, are going to kind of dominate this playing field, whereas the smaller newsrooms, again, their capacity, as Styli's also pointed out, is sometimes limited and so on. So how do you see this playing out? And maybe in line with that, a lot of people talk about the bias of the algorithm in terms of, especially, you know, Africans opposed to other people. Can you talk a little bit about that and how it may impact negatively or positively on the work of journalists?
Absolutely. I want to start with the first part of your question, Gwen, because I think that's extremely relevant and important about the divide between North and South. The short answer is that that divide is real, and we shouldn't just pretend that is not there. As I started approaching this topic 3 years ago, when the project that I manage was launched, it was pretty clear that all the examples that I could find by doing research online were from American and European newsrooms. It's easier for them to get on the global stage, but also in general, they could be more advanced for a variety of reasons in terms of their technological capabilities. That's exactly why our project made it as its mission to try to do something about that gap. So at the core of what we do is really helping the smaller newsrooms, the newsrooms in part of the world that maybe don't get that same exposure to technological advancements, to kind of keep up. In the report that we published in 2019, that was one of the key elements that Professor Charlie Beckett, who's the director of the project and the author of the report, outlined, that really there is this gap that is growing within the industry. And that's not good for anyone in the industry itself. It's not good for the ecosystem. It's not good for the trust that you were referring to before. So in that sense, we have started, and we are in the process of really figuring out how can we help small newsrooms? How can we make sure that what we're learning from the experts across the world becomes available for everyone else? And we just finished, for example, a couple of weeks ago, our first training program for small newsrooms in this. So it's called the AI Academy for Small Newsrooms. And it was a 6-week intensive program for news organizations with less than 100 employees from Europe, Africa, and Middle East. So there were organizations like Africa Check, the Nigerian Investigative Journalism Network, Madam Asri in Egypt, and many others. And with them, with the participants, we tried to connect them with our experts to really understand what are their challenges and what are their resources, what are their data pipelines, what is the culture in terms of technology implementation in the newsroom, and how can we make sure to start building and helping them with the resources they need to move those first steps. Obviously, it's something that we're doing together. We are not the experts, so it's not us telling others what to do. It's kind of us trying to filter the knowledge that is most relevant, so then we can make it available for everyone else.
Right, and try and achieve more balance, as you say, between North, South. Styli, any thoughts from you on that particular subject?
Yeah, only to echo what's been said, that it is real, it does exist, but it also takes, I think, the only way that we're going to change that is through the leadership of the organization, recognizing the importance and the value that can be achieved through embracing AI as an opportunity rather than a risk, and then making the moves to make that happen, right? So funding, resource constraints, all that, working around that, but realizing that this is important enough and enough of a game changer for us to make those investments.
Right. Styli, I wonder if I can just go back to something I'd alluded to earlier to ask you about, and that is your use of AI in determining your audience and their needs and their likes and dislikes in terms of the news coverage, which I believe you've done something on that. I'm sort of concerned here with the kind of wants and needs debate. You know, we all looking at that subject as journalists and looking at getting good journalism to the people. And of course, we're always faced with the question, do they really want that good journalism? Is it the clickbait and the infotainment they're interested in? And how do you, if that is the feedback you're getting, and I don't know, you'll tell us what that is, from your audience, what are they interested in, and how do we ensure that good journalism is put at the top of the heap? And will they still come back if we are trying to give them the truth rather than the fluff and the clickbait that so many of them seem to want? Is that a...
Yeah, Gwen, it's a question that I think a lot of organizations grapple with, and I think the way to solve it is you've got to have a foundation that is based upon the vision and the mission of the organization. Correct. Which in itself needs to be based upon the answer to this question, right? What is journalism for? Right, that's the absolute foundational thing. You need to answer that question. What is journalism for in your mind as the organization that you work for? We are going through that process again. Does the entire organization know what our vision and mission is? Can they repeat it without having to look it up somewhere, right? And then from there, what are the key themes that we as an organization stand for? What are we going to focus our energy and our resources on for this next year? And where does that vision, how does that vision overlap with the needs of our audience, right? And for me, that's how we solve this problem. It's at that intersection, in that Venn diagram in the middle, where those two overlap, the needs of our audience versus our vision and what we want to achieve in this world. And it's in that sweet spot where I think we can get that both the reach, the engagement, the impact, the numbers, and then also the change that we'd like to see in the world is by focusing our resources there. And so you have to do a lot of introspection as well as a lot of research and learning and listening about the needs of our audiences versus their wants, and recognizing that they have a variety of needs, right? Not just a need to find out something new, but in a world that's going through a really tough time, in a region that's going through a really tough time, in a country that's going through a tough time, people also sometimes have a need to be diverted from all of this. So how can you still stay true to your mission and still recognize and service that need that people have? And that could be through satire or cartoons or something else, or even crosswords, for example, where you can still stay true to your mission, but it requires that the entire organization knows those foundational aspects of what journalism is for and what it should be for, and your vision and mission and your key strategies that you want to go down that road. And then once you know all of that, you can start collecting the data points to be able to help you measure and understand how well are we doing on that mission. Are we achieving what we said we were going to, that we set out to do? Are certain areas not doing well enough, or maybe certain formats? And then we start collecting that data, but knowing that we have a strategy and a plan and a game plan, first of all, and that this is how we understood our audience's needs to be, and then go from there.
Right. I must say, personally, I'm hoping for an algorithm that can kind of stimulate the public appetite for good and truthful journalism. So maybe that's something we can start working on in the future. Styli, yeah, please go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I don't think we need to stimulate that need. I think it's a combination of doing, deeper work on understanding that need. Maybe it's testing and experimenting on the format, or how else we can do that to build up that engagement. Who are these audiences, and how can we test things? Sometimes it's as simple as testing headlines, right? It could be and getting people interested in it, or recognizing that, look, 50% of the people who start the story drop off by the halfway mark. Does that mean the story is too long? Does that mean we can do better at what we put up front in the top of the story? Should it be an audio version of the story instead of a 800 words of text? So it's about getting into this mindset of, this is our hypothesis, this is what we're testing, and then looking at those results and saying, well, actually that worked or it didn't work. Let's do less of that, let's change that, or let's do more of this because it is working in line with the plan, the game plan that we had. And so not just letting the data tell us, what we should do. It's like, well, what is this data telling us in relation to the game plan we started out with? Exactly.
Styli, just a very quick question before I turn to Mattia, and that is something that's piqued my curiosity for a while now. And obviously Maverick came into the world as a sort of digital project. And then you took the decision to bring out a newspaper. And I'm just wondering how and if AI figured in that decision at all.
Not necessarily.
Going back to an old era when you've started out on in the digital world. We didn't use a lot of AI, but we did use a lot of data in making that decision. So we asked people to vote on which stores we were thinking of launching in. We did pilots, we tested hypotheses, we did a lot of audience research and trying to understand what is the need for printed product in a time of so much digital information and over stimulus of news content that's out there in the world. And so we used all of that, a lot of product thinking, to really figure out, what is the job that a weekly print publication needs to do in this digital time, and then designed a product based on that, and then used audience data, surveys, pilot data to then
come up with the distribution model and a business model off the back of that as well. So yeah, and then how we would use it now is to optimize distribution and potential areas of expansion.
Absolutely, good one. Mattia, just a quick one to you in your, training and networking with media all over the show. How do you find, are journalists generally speaking resistant, or are they keen on the sort of prospect of an AI future in their work? And is there a sort of divide between the older and the younger journalists? I mean, are the younger journalists more keen and the older ones more resistant, perhaps, to this new phenomenon, if you like?
I can't say that in my experience of these 3 years, I noticed any generational divide about that. It's mostly about culture, in a sense, and just openness to think about the question that Styli was posing before, what journalism is for. At the end of the day, if one is open to reflect on that question genuinely, the age doesn't matter, and then AI can come into the process. So both prospects that you highlighted are real. Surely there is some resistance, and clearly there is a lot of hype as well about what AI can do. But we have also noticed, really from most journalists we interacted with, this openness to think, okay, AI, tell me more about it. I really want to understand what it is. And then once they get the picture, and once we understand that it's really about the audience needs that Styli was referring to, mostly there is a general openness about thinking of the technology. In general, the resistance comes and stems from the misunderstanding about the idea of robots will take over our jobs, or the images that you see online of a robot hand typing on a keyboard, which makes you think that's going to replace the journalist. Once those misunderstandings are out of the door, which is not always easy, then I think the openness and really understanding of the potential of AI comes in, and everyone really understands it.
Okay, but there may be an additional worry, which is not necessarily the robot phenomenon, but the issue of data processors and technicians and taking over in the newsrooms, because they'd be more necessary, and many journalists won't be able to, or don't have that skill set to implement AI, if you like, in their work. So, I mean, that might be a concern on the part of dyed-in-the-wool journalists, put it that way.
Absolutely. And I think it's also kind of make us reflect on what does it mean to be a journalist nowadays. Like a newsroom 50 years ago was completely different in terms of roles than a newsroom nowadays. And that's not because of AI. You didn't have social media editors years ago. You didn't need developers and designers maybe, or as many years ago as after we're all online. So AI is kind of like part of a process of technology that has happened through decades and maybe more. Obviously, it feels like a bigger leap, but I wouldn't single it out as something specific in this transition to just newsrooms adapting to the time and that data and technology available.
Thanks for that, Mattia. I think, I've got tons of questions because this is a fascinating subject, but can I quickly turn to Nina and Patrick and ask if there's any kind of questions, feedback from those listening in that they want to ask questions of our panelists? Nina?
We do have a comment from, I think it's Christoph Maleski. He says, Styli, interesting that you have basically gone against the stream. While other preach reduction in print runs or going more online, you started a printed version. So would you say it's about the quality of content, or what led to the decision? That's if you may want to share a bit more.
Yeah. Not exactly the AI topic, but to share very briefly, we had a hypothesis that there's still place for a weekly printed product in this world. The kind of journalism that we do lends itself to the printed format. And we thought there was an opportunity that there, in a niche product category, that even in the decline of print, that there's still a need for quality journalism. And yeah, that was the hypothesis that we went out and we tested, and there's been, and we went out with an innovative business model as well, where we partnered with a supermarket loyalty program in order to make it free for those who swipe their card. and for us to be able to get data around that and work with them to try and innovate on the business model side as well. So that was the thinking, and it's still very much we're 1 year in, having launched in COVID. So to get to 1 year, I think is it's still worthy of a pat to the back, and we'll see where it goes. We're still trying to innovate but we see there's definitely, as part of the revenue and the product mix, there's still definitely a need for quality printed weekly product, especially.
That's good news. Maybe, Nina, quickly, I just want to tell maybe our participants, I think the subject is quite a daunting one to a lot of people. And just to assure our participants, there's no silly questions here, so please do make use of this opportunity and ask people who've really been working in this area any things you may be curious about. Because I must say, I wanted to pose something else to Styli, and that is, he will know there's a lot of talk in our part of the world about the fourth industrial revolution. And I'm kind of not seeing that happening right where we are. And I'm wondering, how does AI fit into this fourth industrial revolution in terms of journalism and the media? And are we ready for it, Styli, in Africa?
Yeah. Well, obviously, the first thing that we have to consider is just the loss of skills and talent that has been lost to the industry globally, but also even that we've experienced an even bigger loss in this part of this world, Gwen, which you'll be familiar with, where we've lost half of the permanently employed workforce in the last decade, right? So how do you, in that kind of environment, how do you innovate when you have this sword hanging over your head, where you have revenues going backwards, where you have all the stress and the anxiety of being in this business in this region as well, which are sometimes even worse and harder to bear than some of the more developed markets. So how do you, within that environment, how do you then go and start talking about AI and innovating and changing the world and adopting all these new processes? But I think what has become clear, and I think the news industry and media business was insulated from the normal requirements of innovation because of barriers to entry that I think the industry had. And so for 50, 60 years, they were able to get away without really having to innovate that much. But now those barriers are gone. And we are faced with this situation, the reality of that every business has, which is you have to innovate or you die. Like, that is the bottom line. And we either need to appreciate that AI can help us innovate better, faster, quicker, and produce, ultimately, regardless of what it does for us, can it produce a better service for our audiences? Does it produce a better product at the end of the day? Yeah. And if the answer is yes, then we have to go there and we have to make those tough decisions and the investments to be able to make that happen. And so it's like that early adoption curve. You'll see some people and people with the budgets and I guess the leadership and the priorities will start being the early adopters, and there'll be and then as it becomes more and more part of daily life and more tools become easier available or affordable, then we'll start adopting those at a greater scale. But it's coming, right? And we just, we either need to be open to that or we're going to get left behind. And I think of how it changed, for example, other example, autopilots for airplanes, right? And where long haul airplanes pilots were able to, not have to exert energy and focus when for 95% of the flight, but then they used for takeoff and landing and any emergency activities, or portfolio managers who have to analyze this huge universe of investment opportunities, but who can use AI to filter that down to the top 20, 30 possible investments and then make those highly value add, creative, analytical decisions that they can make those investment decisions once the AI has been used as a tool to narrow that down and to give them the best possible opportunity of making the best investment decision. And I think we can view it in that light, that it can make journalism a better product and a better service for our audiences.
And I think I'm hearing you say, Styli, that really we in Africa need to particularly innovate and take the initiative as far as this is concerned. It almost leads me to a question which I won't pose now, but I'll leave it in your heads, and that is the sort of what the smaller newsrooms may be doing in terms of AI and how they can reduce dependency on big tech, that they are not writing our, if you like, our AI needs with inbuilt biases that there may be at that level of things. So let me leave you with that and check with Nina and Patrick if there's anything else, any questions coming in. Okay.
Yes, we do have a question from Chloe. Chloe saying, seeing as there are no dumb questions, would you count a WhatsApp bot as AI? Is that something the Daily Maverick would ever consider using? Why or why not?
Styli, over to you.
Maybe Mattia is better placed to answer this, but I say if they, depending on how the bot is set up and how much natural language processing is used for that bot to be able to make decisions, you know, is it a very simple rules-based bot, in which case it probably, you know, I don't know if it would strictly qualify as AI, but if the more natural language processing that is involved in there, the more sort of decision making that is left up to the bot based on, you know, all the inputs that it's taking in, then it can absolutely be qualify as an AI effort, and we would definitely consider using something like that. You know, as we grow, as we look at how do we better serve our members. For example, we're now up to 17,000 members. The number of queries, support queries that are coming through. So after the fact, ahead of the fact, in terms of like how we can better inform or educate or use it for marketing, all those opportunities are going to be, you know, and as we try to get to 100,000, we have to be thinking about, well, how do we get there in the best and most efficient way? What if someone's logging on in the middle of the night and wants to ask a question because they're a reader from, you know, America, for example, right? We can serve their need right there and then, or we can wait a day or two until some person gets to that, you know, that query in number 105 in the queue. You know, so there's definitely scope for that as we look to get bigger and better and create a better offering for our readers.
Thank you, Styli. I think I've succeeded in encouraging some questions. Patrick, Nina, over to you.
Yes, there's another one coming in. This whole idea that there are no stupid questions has really fueled the chat box. So well done, Gwen. Zoe's following up and saying, throwing in a possibly dumb one, does the Africa Free Trade Agreement hold any benefit to media organizations in terms of trade, innovation, and ultimately, say, sustainability?
Who wants to take that one? Maybe it's probably Styli.
I actually don't know enough about that to answer. Sorry. So yeah.
Obviously, it's the same for me, unfortunately. I'm sorry.
Maybe Zoe will have to have a private conversation a bit later to get answers to that one. Anything else, Patrick?
Yes, there is a comment from Peter Daislers. He says, what do journalism learners need to understand about AI? Which skills should be included in journalism training? Also, is the Daily Maverick addressing the use of AI and its transparency in the editorial policy?
Oh, that's a good one. Mattia, do you want to start on the learners and then hand over to Styli for the latter part of the question?
Very happy to, because I have been reflecting myself on that question for at the very least 12 months now. So I can just share where we are in our thinking as a team. With the academy that I was referring to before, obviously that was exactly our question. Even if it was for journalists and already professionals, not necessarily journalism students, the question was the same. What do they actually need to understand? What do we prioritize in all this complex environment? So what we ended up with, the format of the academy, which just to give you an idea of the topic we decided to focus on, we really thought that it was important to start with that literacy element at the beginning. So not taking anything for granted and really answering the kind of questions that we received before. Is a WhatsApp bot AI? What is machine learning and how does it refer? How is it different from AI? Are they the same things? So really just the basics of having the literacy to then be able to build on top of that literacy. Use cases are extremely useful at the start, as we have done at the start of this conversation, kind of to clarify a little bit what we're talking about and not start approaching AI with the science fiction mindset in mind. And after that, what we identified as the key element of this process were on the side, really having an honest and open conversation about data and technology before the AI part. Because as we've been referring to throughout this conversation, AI is very cool, but if you don't have the data in place to then build your machine learning models, for example, on top, AI is useless. So what is your data pipeline? What are your data pipelines in the newsrooms? What are already tools available for you, or what else can we help you understand you can use relatively with limited resources? So the data point. And after that, a really open conversation about the culture and the people. What skills are needed in the newsroom? Styli was referring to before, what kind of buy-in from the leadership there is, because without that one, also implementation is going to struggle. How do you set up a team efficiently, as multidisciplinary as possible, to make sure that across the newsrooms you have the benefit from these new technologies? And there are different ways to go about that. Some organizations decide to start with a specific team that is entirely focusing on AI strategy. In other cases, this responsibility is more distributed, and you involve people that are already in your existing teams and departments, and you create those AI champions that also Styli was referring to before across the newsroom. So these are just some of the elements that we included in there, but I really think the use cases, the data, and really focusing on the people are the key elements in here. I would just add to finish, also just to get into the conversation from the start, the risks and the concerns about using AI. You were referring to about bias before, Gwen. It's about that as much as it is about unintended consequences from a financial point of view, from an editorial point of view. Those need to be at the start again of this learning process.
Exactly. And I was actually going to probably end off my questions to you by saying we focused a lot on the positives of AI, and I wanted to end off by the two of you looking at the dangers. And one of my favorite phrases is the garbage in, garbage out principle. If the data is wrong and we, got AI working on that, then obviously the consequences are probably disastrous for good journalism. But let Styli first answer the latter part of Peter's question, Styli.
Yeah, I think it's important that when we allow AI to be responsible or mostly responsible for the creation of content, then it needs to be clearly labeled. And you'll see that, I think, in the case of, was it the AP that really started and pioneered those financial reporting templates off the back of that, they were labeled as that. I think there's quite a lot of Scandinavian use of property reports these days where, articles are being written by AI. And I think that it's very important in those instances that's labeled, or if it is a bot that is serving and assisting someone, the word bot is used there, that people understand that they're being served by an AI. But I think when it's being used merely as a tool in the background and editorial decisions are being made by humans, then I don't really see the need to update that. It's just one of many tools that are used, and I don't see the necessity there. But when it crosses the line and the content, and we're not there yet. We're not there where we have AI creating that. But when we do, it'll need to be clearly marked as such that AI was used to create the better part of this, or this article was created off the back of an AI program.
Okay. Thank you for that. Anything else, Nina?
Yes, perhaps a silly question from my end, from myself. You did mention, Mattia, that when we say AI, people generally think robots, and we become uneasy. When we talk about robots, and humans generally have this affinity to distrust robots. Does the use of AI in journalism media then advance our objective of restoring trust?
I think the answer, and sorry, I'm not trying to sneak out, but the answer is it depends. It depends on how it is used. The fact of using a new technology doesn't increase or decrease trust by default. It's just about following what we're saying in this wonderful conversation, really about making it a responsible use, being transparent, as we were just saying in Styli's answer, about where AI is used, when it's appropriate to be transparent, because in some cases, I also think often we're just talking about tools, and journalists use many other tools, and you don't see in the byline of an article, spreadsheets were used to crunch the numbers that help us write this article. So in the same way, you don't always need to put that necessarily into the byline. It depends on the level of responsibility that was given to the technology. So yeah, I don't know if it's an appropriate answer to your question. Surely not a direct one, but I think it's the honest one. It really depends on us, the humans, how we use the technology to then see if they have an impact positively or negatively on the trust part of the conversation.
Right. I wonder if we can look a little bit at the well, you've alluded to them, but the dangers and the possibility of abuses. Because like anything else, AI can also be used to negative effect. Styli, I don't know if you want to, are there any sort of cautionary tales around this that you could say that journalists and newsrooms particularly need to look out for? And again, maybe in line with that is, what about the, I don't want to use the word threat, but the looming specter of big tech doing all these things and taking the initiative from us? Is that something we need to be careful with in terms of watching out for those inbuilt biases that are present in a lot of AI that's happening?
Yeah, and I think a lot of those threats or a lot of those risks become more prevalent if you go into this without a clear strategy and without a clear intention of how it is you want to be using this. And again, if the vision and the mission of the organization isn't clear either as an overarching guiding policy. So if you have those foundational things in place, then we can bolt this on and use this as an additional tool to get us to where we want to be and into achieving our vision. And the other risk, I think, is and potentially not maybe even a malicious one, but is if we place too much reliance on what AI can do and just don't sanity check stuff as well, then we can end up causing, I guess, maybe incompetence risk on the back of that. Because we're at that stage now where it's still the early days, and the efficacy of a lot of these things needs to be ironed out, and you need to grapple quite a lot with all these things until you get to a place where you can actually place reliance on the stuff to be throwing up consistently usable and outputs that are that can be used and that are in service of the vision and mission of the organization. So there are those kinds of risks, and again, as Mattia said, this is about what is the intention of the people who are driving this process. What are the motives, and that needs to, and that will reflect in how the AI is used in the pursuit of journalism.
Right. Anything you'd like to add to that, Mattia?
I think what Styli says really is very comprehensive. Like, just because we're talking about the big tech, and that was mentioned as well, a disclaimer is needed, of course, that our project is also entirely funded by the Google News Initiative. So I'm very acquainted with working with the big tech world as well. I think when it comes to the risks, I was trying to jotting down in my notebooks as we were speaking here. I think the risks are really related to data, and the risk, the bias that we were referring to, can really come in at all the stages of the process. That's why it's complex, and that's why we need to be aware of how we're using this tool and be responsible about it. Because I think we're thinking about data. The bias can come in straight from the start of how the data is sourced. Also, there is a question of privacy. Do we have the right to use that data, first of all? And do we know how that data was sourced, where it comes from? And can we trust that data to not have already bias in it? Because if the initial data is already biased, garbage in, garbage out, as you were saying, there's not much we can do. And then through the process, the same. What algorithms are we using? Do we know, at least at the basic level, how those algorithms work to avoid the risk of bias creeping in the processing of the data itself. And then moving to the end of the pipeline, when we're churning out, responses are churned out by the algorithms using that data, do we have the literacy to understand, the journalist in this case, the data, and to analyze the data to see if bias came in before presenting it to our audiences? So there are many pain points. So it's really about coming in with the right mindset, the literacy needed, and the responsibility of knowing what is our journalism for.
And a very clear plan, as Styli has said. Nina, something else from participants?
Well, not from the participants, Gwen, but Patrick does have a question, and then I do as well. So I'll let him go first. Yes.
Great, thanks, Nina. Go ahead, Patrick.
Thank you very much, Gwen. You know, it's interesting talking particularly about fourth IR. There's a professor in Brazil, Professor Barqua, who says these aren't actually industrial revolutions, these are human revolutions. And he particularly mentions how we created tools first, and then we created tools to create tools. We had tools for production, and now we are the tool. So are you saying that the future of journalism education is embedded in a revolution, or is it just a paradigm shift?
There's a good one for both of you. Styli, do you want to go ahead?
I'm going to go with potentially both. I think journalism as a craft has to evolve, as any other craft or any other service needs to evolve as the needs of audiences change over time. I think the fundamental and the principles of what journalism is for, I don't think that will change or won't change for a long time. But I think a lot of the how and the needs that are being that need to be served, you know, we have some basic needs that won't change, but there'll be some, you know, some other needs that will change. So I think that a lot of the stuff is around how we approach that, how we think about how we think about using all these tools, how we can reach new audiences. So it's very much, I think, in order for the revolution to happen, we need the paradigm shift to occur first, and then we can either be part of that, or, you know, and if we're not part of that, then we're going to be fighting against it. But, you know, like with all these things, they eventually do come for us at the end of the day. And I think it's already settled that this will be the way the world works. And so, you know, do we want to be using that to be better at what we do, or do we want to resist it and fight against the tide?
Right, Mattia, do you want to add anything to that? It's a good question, I think.
Yeah, it's a good question, but the answer of Styli was so good that I don't know if I have much to add to that. I really, really think it's about the paradigm shift we're mentioning. And as Styli was saying, the revolution comes from that. I think if I was starting a journalism program in a university tomorrow, I probably would ask my students every single day what journalism is for, which we have been repeating a lot here, because it's not about the technology. It's not necessarily about being better at drafting the articles. Obviously, it's important to be good writers, to be journalists, but at the end of the day, it's important and it's critical not to go about journalism without thinking about the motivation and the mission that we may have as being part of this industry. It's not about creating content. It's not about creating as much content as possible. It's really reflecting on those user needs and how we can make sense of them to be the best we can at informing the audiences and entertain them and update them, and really giving them all the information they needed to then act in society with the information that they need. So it's kind of not about the AI, I guess I want to say. It's about really all the reflection that we need to do before, and then technology just comes about how we can use it to be better at achieving our mission.
And the better you are at your job, obviously the more the technology can help. I mean, I'm glad you said that, Mattia, because I'm a great one for hammering the point of getting back to basics for journalists and getting back to the fundamentals of what the profession is or the craft is about. And as Styli said, there are some unchangeables. As we go forward, a lot of the way we do journalism will change, but the basic fundamental principles of journalists itself should stay. And yet there are people who disagree with me and said, oh, you know, don't hammer on the basics of ethics and all these things. You're better off telling people to go and dance in the streets about climate change, which is going to be the big story of the future. So it's very interesting, but I think you've helped consolidate my view that it still is about the basics of good, independent, professional journalism and building trust, winning back trust, if you like, and telling the truth through that. I think we're getting to the end of things, so I'm wondering if I should ask the two of you just to give a last few comments on things you may feel we've missed. It's been a fascinating conversation. And then, or perhaps I can quickly ask Nina if there's anything else burning from the point of the view of the participants, and then give Mattia and Styli the chance to make some closing remarks. Nina?
Nothing at this point, Gwen, so they can go ahead with their closing remarks.
Good. Okay. Let me give you, as I say, there might be issues we haven't covered and we could have talked a lot longer, but Styli, would you like to go ahead? Any final sort of remarks about our topic today?
Yeah, it's an important one. These discussions, I think, really help enlighten and create awareness around the need to start looking and incorporating these practices and these and this kind of thinking in our organizations. Like we're no longer a sheltered industry. We are no longer sheltered from the economic forces of the realities out there. And as I mentioned earlier, we really are in a place where we need to innovate or we will die, right? And I think part of that innovation will come from how we use data and technology, and artificial intelligence is going to be a bigger part of that, as we just simply will not be able to make sense or be able to use all the amount of data that we have available to us. But we need to have a plan, and I think that's the key thing here is we need to have a plan on how we're going to engage with it, who's going to be responsible for it, how we can fund it, how we can learn to incorporate it and get involved in programs like the Journalism Accelerator, AI Journalism Accelerator for small newsrooms, which is an amazing opportunity for organizations to bridge that divide we were talking about earlier. And but all the while remembering that we have to bring it back to the why. Why are we here as media organizations, as journalists? The why, in my mind, doesn't change. The how and the what will most likely change and evolve as we go along. But if we can still stay true to our why and still evolve and become better practitioners of this public service that we call journalism, and using these amazing tools to be even better at what we do.
Right. And an important question you've just raised now, which we haven't explored, and that is the issue of the cost of AI. And seen against the sort of battle for sustainability of media around the world, that's something that needs to be looked at as well, because it simply adds to an already difficult issue. But as Styli has said, if you've got a plan and you're innovating and there's initiative, there may be ways to conquer that. So thank you for that, Styli. Mattia, some closing remarks from you?
I think it was an amazing conversation, and we really touched upon most of the important elements in here. If I just had to think about something that we didn't discuss that we as a team believe it's important in the conversation around AI, is the idea of collaboration. Like, we really don't have to be all here reinventing the wheel, closed in our own offices. There is so much opportunity, and we're testing that opportunity with some of our activities for journalists and organizations, especially small organizations without their own resources, to come together and make the most of the knowledge available and really accelerating that process of learning by doing it together rather than everyone looking at their screen at home. But I am also a believer, if I can be a little provocative, that your question about the costs there is an opportunity to think about what costs can we share as organizations. Small organizations across the world will not have the opportunity to all hire the data scientists and AI experts they need. But the world of work is changing, and people are used to consulting for different projects at the same time. I don't think we're so far away from the moment where 3 or 4 small news organizations come together, share a pot of money, and they hire those AI skills that they need to all benefit from it at the same time. So just as a closing remark, probably this idea that collaboration is possible, we are seeing it, and especially to make the most of this technology and not depend only on the big tech that we were referring to before, is also like hopefully coming for everyone else.
I mean, I think from what both of you have said, that AI is clearly the future. And we just have to make sure that we've got it in our sights, so to speak, especially, you know, on the African continent. Collaboration is key. If you think of how much has been done with collaborative journalism, you know, International Journalist Organization, it was unthinkable decades ago that that would happen. So, Mattia, maybe you're right, that that's the way forward, especially for smaller media, to deal with the issue of cost and to collaborate. Styli, maybe as one of the sort of people at the tip of the AI landscape, really, who's looking forward. That's maybe something to bear in mind for the future, that Maverick also can share with other media, you know, on the continent as we go forward. And that we develop a better understanding, because the training of journalists is key in this regard, so that they know what they're talking about. Because again, AI, without the skills to implement it, a plan going forward is useless. And then we do get back to the garbage in, garbage out. So all I can do from my part, Nina, Patrick, you may want to add something. I just want to thank Mattia and Styli so much for making time for what was a very interesting conversation. I'm sure our participants also were very engaged in this, and I hope we can follow up again sometime in the future and find out how it's going and where we've moved on from this point. So thanks to the both of you. Patrick, Nina.
Thank you very much, Gwen. I think the inertia of fighting technology, and not what I always tell people, we need to update our software, you know, just in terms of how these So I think these guys have really helped in terms of updating my software and not really being unnecessarily fearful. But I think it's a very important conversation, because I think it's really about institutional memory a lot of the times, and about, you know, the type of data that we are faced with. And if that can happen more efficient, there's a lot of news to process. There's much happening in the world. So I really think it speaks to our needs in this context. So very much of a necessary topic. And Gwen, thank you for doing such a good job in moderation. I love how you keep it real and understandable in the way that people here consume the information given. So thank you.
Siveza iqiniso, sivuselela ukuthembeka.